Hi everybody. So welcome on my behalf too. It's actually a lot of fun to be here in the Stadstuin in the Werkspoorfabriek, because this happens to be a place where we as Expodium have been walking around outside, of course, not inside, for at least for 6 years. And the why and the how of why actually we walk this former industrial area in our city of Utrecht. I'll get to that later. First of all, I'd like to say a special hello to Susan Jenkins, who is actually the one that connected CreativeMornings Utrecht to Expodium. And I guess she did so because she thought that one of us at Expodium were a collective of 3 persons. There's also Nikos Doulos, Bart Witte, might be able to actually say something that might be of interest to all of you listeners at home or wherever you are for the upcoming 20 minutes. As Charlotte said, I like to take up the theme of being resilient in the context of how actually we are living in our contemporary cities. But before doing that, let's take a small detour, and then in a little walk, we're going to have a few more detours, and then in the end we might end up somewhere. And then I hope you might perhaps have a few questions, you never know. I have a few slides that you'll be seeing over here. It says hi, because hi is an important word for my presentation, and I think actually for life in general and for resilience too. So why is it so important? Because it is maybe the start for a lot of small talk. And small talk, some people have been arguing, mostly in The Guardian, which, and I think we need to stress this, is an English newspaper, and English people tend to be a little bit insecure about social relations if they're not drunk. So it might be that actually it's English newspapers that have articles like this a little more. Let's face it, 2021 is shaping up to be an awful year for small talk. But I think I've seen pieces in Dutch newspapers too where people were saying, I don't know what to talk about with my friends, or even worse, I wouldn't know why I would go to a bar because I have nothing to talk about. Can I still talk with people? Let's not forget that we're actually facing the end of a pandemic period where we have been in lockdown, and a lot of the measures that we have been living under might be measures and patterns that actually are reflected in longer term thinking about urban strategies. So let's first have a little look about what it is that makes our city so modern these days. This is an image taken from the British firm Forensic Architecture, who use a lot of contemporary technology to reframe and research certain accidents. They offer their services for free to activists, to human rights organizations, and what they do is look at metadata in the city. So this can be your mobile phones, this can be safety cameras, this can be CCTV installations inside houses, and what they do is they reconstruct a killing on a activist in Athens, or they try to rebuild a prison that Assad had built in Syria by just the testimonies of people that have been hearing because they were blindfolded. And they are on the edge of research on what our cities are also. Our cities are bastions, are fortresses of technology that are actually controlling a lot of the ways how we behave in a city. So if you look at the city as something that is a medieval thing with a wall around it, of course this is gone, and we've gone over to a city that has been suburbanized, that might be post-urbanized, where our inner cities have become historical resorts. Think about the city of Utrecht with its beautiful channels and then nothing around it, and then you hit the suburbs around it. So we have generic landscapes filled with sprawl, and because all of us sitting at home ordering, we have a lot of warehouses that are also popping up here in the region of Utrecht. And it means that we are interacting less and less with people that are our fellow citizens in our city. And that brings me to a book by a Belgian poet, philosopher, writer, activist also, Lieven de Kouter. And this is a book, The Capsular Civilization, that he published in 2004. That is by heart, so don't take me granted on this. And it's a book in which he has published a bunch of essays on what he calls the city in the age of fear. And remember, this is before we were all having Spotify, before we were all having our modern phones that could keep us connected to the screen or to our earplugs. And still, he said, and the cover image is taken from Melilla, the small exclave on the Moroccan coast, the Spanish exclave where you see all the fences. And of course, not all of our cities are as divided as Melilla or Ceuta, but the idea of fences, safety cameras, militarized border patrol is not that far away from even a beautiful, charming city as Utrecht. And let me quote a few things from the book. Lieven de Kouter says, the capsule is the cyborg architecture. Man, machine and space build a body that actually transcends confrontation because we don't meet each other anymore. We have outsourced our confrontations with the other. It also means we have no spontaneous interaction with the other anymore. And we are living in a system of fear, an ecology of fear, as we quote Mark Davis. It might remind us of something. Fear of the other, walking to the other side of the street if somebody is walking your way, not meeting up in a little park to say hi to one another, because the other could be a danger. Indeed, it smells a little bit like pandemic times, as Nirvana would say. Pandemic times in which we, the affluent people, were locked inside our homes. We ordered via that Cyberbia network, and then people from a different class would come to our doors and deliver all the goods that we have been ordering. A capsular society. For a lot of people, this is actually not what a city should look like. I guess a lot of you watching here would like to have a city be different, a city where we can meet each other spontaneously, where there's fun, when there's play, when there's things that we actually think are human rather than just not meeting one another. And of course, a lot of people have been thinking about then how to design cities that look like spaces where you can meet one another, or why is it that cities are designed differently so that people do not meet one another. One of the people that thought about this for a long time is Walter Benjamin, German philosopher who in the end committed suicide while being on the run for the Nazis in 1940. And it is no coincidence that Lieven de Kouter, author of the book that is here, actually wrote his dissertation on Walter Benjamin. Walter Benjamin is one of the first philosophers who wrote about technology and the dark sides that technology might bring. He was one of the first thinkers to actually argue that technology and living in big modern cities could also intensify feelings of isolation and atomization, so living on our own without interacting with the others. And he would say that with the upcoming of the modern era with controlled mass systems, this is the 20s and the 30s, cities were part of that control, which worked by keeping the rich and the poor apart, and it's not something that he liked very much. He's very famous for an essay on Paris. The arcades of Paris, where actually he's comparing the Paris before Straussmann turned the little streets where everybody could mingle into the big avenues that the army could use to suppress uprisings, as happened with the Commune in 1870. So I'm quoting Walter Benjamin here, who says, "I like cities that are porous labyrinths, annulling class, time, space, and even distinctions of light and dark." That's why perhaps Walter Benjamin likes cities as Marseille or Napoli in Italy, even Moscow, where that might have also been on his political preferences. But at least he loves cities where people would intermingle, where there would be opportunities for people to just coincidentally meet or have things that are not planned. And he was not alone in this. Here's the poster girl of modern urbanism, Jane Jacobs. Jane Jacobs was an American journalist living in Manhattan, Greenwich Village to be precise. And this is a time, of course, after the Second World War, 60s, where our idea of suburbanization had come to the fore, where we would not be living in the inner cities, but we would all be living in the suburbs. And that, of course, was enabled by the revolution of the mass production, started in Detroit by Henry Ford, of the car. So the American idea was people would be living outside of the cities, use the highway, drive into the cities, and then those cities would be the places where the money was made, and then you would return home and spend time with your family at home. These highways, and perhaps there is no coincidence here, were often constructed on parts of the city where there would be neighborhoods where there was a lot of, let's say, organized life, perhaps black communities that were also having a tradition of trade unionism, or white working class neighborhoods that were well organized on political level too. Because for some reason the people working in the construction, and in the case of New York this man was called Robert Moses, and the city governments to actually control their city. So Jane Jacobs had seen this happening, and when actually the place where she was living, Greenwich Village, was also under threat of being destroyed because of the construction of a highway coming in, she thought, but this is not what I want. I like living in my small neighborhood with a shop, a small production company, perhaps some craftsmanship, a baker, different people, different strands of life, living in one neighborhood where actually people would be living above the stores on the ground floor. And this is what she liked. She liked city life. And she feared that by the construction of highways, it would not only be the destruction of a physical village, but also of a mental village. So she started interviewing people, asking them what was the best way that they liked their little surroundings, and it turned out that a lot of people were agreeing with her that a place where you could have coincidence, where you could have interactions with people that were not necessarily, in, let's say, a modern word, your echo chamber, were possible. And it's even so far by Jane Jacobs that there's a famous anecdote when she was sitting in a bar with one of her followers. Next to them was a very drunk man, and the man was having a conversation with Jane Jacobs, said, "This man is so drunk, we need to get him to the doctor, or at least do something about it." And Jane Jacobs said, "Why? If the man decided to be drunk, I guess he has a reason. Let him be drunk. This is city life. You can't control everything in your surroundings." And perhaps that is something to remember when we think about what cities might look like. Because if people are trusting one another and are also trusting the drunkard in the bar to be drunk for that certain reason, and maybe he might be drunk the day after, maybe not, it's okay. Because if you accept the differences living around you, then you accept this too. So let's get to yet another example. This is a book that is more recent. It's by Eric Kleinenberg. Well, suppose you can all read yourself. It says here, Eric Kleinenberg, well done. And it's called Palaces for the People. It is a take on libraries, taken from, I think, Carnegie, who in the beginning of last century decided to build a lot of libraries for the people, palaces for the people. But Eric Kleinenberg is not focusing on libraries only. He's focusing on all those public spaces that would enable us to build a more equal and united society. So he's thinking about kindergartens, he's thinking about daycare centers, he's thinking about religious buildings, he's thinking about places like the Stadstuin here in the Werkspoorfabriek. And why does he do so? Because for him one word is very important for his research. The book that he published before writing this book was actually a case study into a heat wave in Chicago. And that heat wave in Chicago had very different consequences for one neighborhood as it had for another neighborhood. In one neighborhood the death toll was actually huge, and in another neighborhood they had less death. He thought, this is very odd. Why is this? The population size is equal, the age groups are similar, even the incomes of people are similar. So then what caused the difference in death toll, death rate? Found out that actually it had to do with what he called social fabric. One neighborhood was a community where people knew each other, would be knocking each other's doors, sometimes would be asking, I have not my soup finished, maybe I can share with you, or would just be asking, how are you doing? And this continued during the heat wave, with a lot of people being stuck inside, being knocked on the door, asking their neighbors, are you still doing okay? This prevented people stuck in their homes not to die, whereas in the other neighborhood people were, let's say, afraid of public space, were afraid of meeting one another, and thus people died in isolation. It was something that struck Eric Kleinenberg, and he then decided to actually dedicate a complete book onto what it is, this social fabric. And excuse me for watching down on the paper, I'm going to quote. Kleinenberg believes that the future of democratic societies rests not simply on shared values, but on shared spaces. The libraries, childcare centers, bookstores, churches, synagogues and parks where crucial, sometimes life-saving connections are formed. These are the places where people gather and linger, making friends across group lines and strengthening the entire community. Kleinenberg, as mentioned before, calls this a social fabric, social infrastructure. When it is strong, neighborhoods flourish. When it's neglected, as it has been in a lot of years and in a lot of places all across the world, families and individuals must fend for themselves. Well, think about yourself and your pandemic experience. I hope that you have all been having some individuals or families around you just to be together and perhaps share the fun, share the burden, because that helps to be a little bit more resilient. Resilient, when you look it up in dictionaries or in other books, is defined, of course, a bit differently. Psychologists would say that resilience is the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or significant sources of stress. An NGO, perhaps working on a global level, would say a resilient community is able to resist, absorb, accommodate, and recover from the effects of a hazard, as Charlotte mentioned about Dallas. Urban planners might say resilience is about preventing disaster. So it might not be coincidence that the city of Rotterdam, here in the Netherlands, has dedicated a lot of their strategy thinking into what it means for a city to be resilient. There's a website, so if you are bored with me talking, you can just head over to resilientrotterdam.nl, and you might see all the presentations that Rotterdam has thought of about how they can be a resilient city. It has to do with flooding, as Rotterdam is next to the sea level, but it has a lot to do with how to actually ensure that people have more interaction and that they get to know each other rather than living in a capsular society. One thing that is not on that website is that actually by just getting to know your neighborhood by foot, and thus also getting to know other pedestrians walking your neighborhood by foot, might be a great way to actually kickstart Resilient City. And then I get to that part where our practice as Expodium comes in. But perhaps before all this, let me ask you, during lockdown, I suppose you were bored too. Perhaps you started to taking a small stroll in the afternoon, half an hour maybe to catch up with lunchtime, or maybe to meet a colleague, or just have a small talk with somebody in your surroundings rather than sitting at home and just do everything by Zoom. So these walks have become very popular over the last few months, and we expected a lot from these walks. They would keep us healthy, they would keep us connected to the real world beyond Zoom. They would maybe, as we say in Dutch, ensure that we still have fresh noses. But it's not fair to expect all of this from a walk of half an hour, when afterwards we would slide back in our chair and behind our screen and just sit and be there in a small little capsule, atomized, because a walk of 30 minutes is never going to do this. If a walk has a purpose, it is not a real walk. Walks make sense when they don't have any purpose. I would even say a walk makes sense when it doesn't make any sense. And then we get to that little beautiful word, flânerie, walking. Walking without a purpose. It might be that I'm in a certain niche, but there's a lot of books about walking. Walking as an artistic practice, walking as a practice of just discovering your city, walking as a way to actually meet yourself. And one of the most famous books of the last 10 years, maybe 15 years ago, is Rebecca Solnit's Wanderlust, A History of Walking. But there's a lot more to say about walking. It's just that this is a very nice book. If you want to start somewhere by reading about what walking could do to you, your community and your city, I recommend this book warm-heartedly. And Wanderlust, of course, is by origin a German word, which means I'm longing to have a walk. But the French word flânerie is the one that is used in literature on artistic research by walking, or walking as an artistic practice. And then of course you have a flâneur, which is the male person acting flânerie, or a flâneuse, the female person acting flânerie. And the word is not by origin French, it is from the Old Norse, at least this is what Wikipedia says, and it comes from flana, to wander with no purpose. And this is important to remember, it's no purpose. And that in times of cost efficiency, in just-in-time management, of planning, it makes sense actually to have something in life that is still sacred, that has no purpose, that is actually allowing you to step out of the rat race and just act like you are a human, a perhaps being that likes to play and like to interact with other people rather than just be stuck to a screen and trying to meet your targets. So walking without a purpose, it might seem a bit provocative, it might seem for some people as totally senseless, but remember, without sense doesn't mean it is completely senseless. Senseless might even mean it is adding something to your life. And over time a lot of people have been thinking about walking a city, have been even taking the concept of walking through a city to different heights. And perhaps a few names to stress: Baudelaire, the French poet, who would smoke a bit of hashish, start walking. Then Walter Benjamin, mentioned before, who would write about what it means to be walking through cities and long for those cities that were not yet completely modern, but accepting that the modernization was coming. Then the Surrealist, and then in the 50s and the 60s, the International Situationist. The philosophical movement in France, led by a notorious guy, Guy Debord, who actually also committed suicide. Well, never mind. And the French Situationists actually thought that to take the provocative style of walking in a city to a bit higher level, they would be making it into a derive, drifting around the city without any purpose. They might even do this while being drunk or while being high or while taking a map of Berlin and walk the streets of Paris, just to make sure that actually their walk would not be a walk taking you from A to B, but would just be a walk that actually would have no purpose and therefore would allow you to have the unexpected in your way, or to have the unexpected person in your way. And actually that is something that we like very much as Expodium. Then let's finish off with a quote by Rebecca Solnit, who said, a city is a language, a repository of possibilities, and that walking is the act of speaking that language. So we have here walking as something that connects you to a city, that actually helps you construct a city, and that actually also helps you construct a city as a citizen, meeting other people just by saying hi. Well, and that's something that we as Expodium have been doing for quite some time. It is 2021, and in 2015, Expodium, the urban do tank that Charlotte introduced, that I'm part of, started a artistic research directory here in Werkspoor, which is the former industrial part of town in Utrecht, between the rail tracks we can see here from the office running to Amsterdam, the rail tracks running there to The Hague, and the big channel that was used to actually transport the steel away from this part and the coals and the raw materials into here. Werkspoor, the area that is the name giver of this area, was a huge steel factory, one of the biggest employers in Utrecht until the beginning of the 80s, and they exported globally. Also, they imported globally, so a lot of people living here in Utrecht that are not having a Dutch origin for centuries ago, Greek people living in Amsterdamse Straatweg, Moroccan and Turkish people living in Overvecht. It is because Werkspoor actually attracted people to work here. And this area, it has been a industrial area until the 80s, and then it turned into one of these zones that you might encounter in a lot of cities. A place where you would normally not go, a place where the police would have a station for cars that are stolen and they can just park them there, a place where a lot of people would have small repair shops to fix cars. One of two old buildings that still remained from the industrial complex and that were slowly deteriorating until at least somebody bought them. And it was this area that the municipality of Utrecht decided would be a creative hotspot. The area now is in the process of changing. Some people are very happy with this. Some people actually complain that the raw edges of the city are disappearing. But let's stay very neutral and say that the gentrification process is happening right now. And it was this gentrification process that we as Expodium were very curious about. What would happen to an area where a lot of people would never go if suddenly there is an influx of people and of, let's say, those creative companies that are transforming an area. So we thought of a trajectory that we called Unmaking the Netherlands. Unmaking the Netherlands has a small nod of the head to the Ministry of Urban Planning in the Netherlands that had decided that 2015 would be their festive year under the banner We Build the Netherlands. And for us as Expodium, the idea that you could have a white paper, draw a city and then start building it, as is actually the case with Leidse Rijn, just the other side of the channel here in Utrecht, or with other parts of the city, it is no longer an idea that actually makes us live in livable cities. Cities are there for a long time, and cities that are actually layer upon layer upon layer upon layer of historical developments are actually those places where we have the lively neighborhoods, where we have the interactions, where we don't have the modernist separated highways, CCTV systems, and people not meeting because it is all manufactured for a suburbia, where we are zooming, ordering, and not meeting one another. So we thought, let's not build the Netherlands, but let's unmake the Netherlands, and not unmake as destroy, but unmake as, let's see what is there, let's see how things develop after one another, how functions follow each other up, how perhaps also people follow each other up, or how nature takes over if humans are not taking care of the city. And this line of thinking led us to actually think of the research line urban cannibalism. Then we had a research line we called play, because, well, we're three guys and maybe that has nothing to do with it, but we just like playing in the city, putting Twister out on the street, inviting people to join us, having a huge cake, cutting it up in the smallest pieces possible so that everybody could have a little bit of the pie. And it will not surprise you, night walking as a practice. Walking for all the reasons that I mentioned, to meet the unexpected in yourself, in the city, to feel acquainted with the city, to be the flaneur, the modern urban spectator, the amateur detective, the investigator of the city, somebody that speaks the language of the city. And we even added an extra layer, the night. Because we think if you experience a city by night, and you experience that the city is not all about being a functional organization, but that it's also just the surroundings where you can meet the unexpected, where you can meet other people, where you can just say hi, meet somebody, have a conversation, and then understand that the other is equal to you, rather than that you have to have fences or security measures to prevent you against the other. That is what we like. So we like Under the Cover of the Night, with the idea that the day after you might look at the city as something that looks different by night, and that perhaps it might look different by day too. And that if you encounter people by night, people are happy to be encountered, that they are happy to be seen, that they are happy to have a conversation with. So we've had meetings with people in the middle of little bushes that were actually having a shelter there, living away from the organized society, and they would still be very happy to meet a few people walking there by night. Or we would have a small dinner with people that were having their own dinner next to their truck, coming from Lithuania, Bulgaria, and I don't know what language they were speaking with us. It was mostly hand and foot signs, as we say. We shared our beer, they shared their food, because people, most of the time when they meet one another, like to be seen as a human, and like to be talked to on equal footing, because this is what we do as humans. We like actually talking to one another. And why is it that if you walk in the mountains or if you walk in a forest, you would always say hello, or if you're German, grüß Gott, to another person, and why would you do so in a city? It's something that I have been asking a lot of times to myself, because one of the first times that I was walking, when I just arrived in Utrecht, the city, I would meet somebody on the street, and well, I'm a village boy, and I said, hi, and that person followed me for a street to ask me, why did I say hi to that person? And I said, well, the street is empty, I think it's normal to say hello to one another, no? He said, yes, but this never happens. I said, well, in my life it happens all the time. And actually I've had fun encounters because of this. And I think it's important to just keep on talking to one another, because it helps you to be a person, it helps the other person to be a person in your eyes, and it helps to be a resilient society. And that helps because then you can be walking together rather than just be walking alone and be scared of the other. And it is not only that it's important for me as a person, there's people that actually gave a lot of thought to why it is important to talk. So this is the last book that I'll be showcasing. Sorry, you can all just Google. Once again, very scholarly, Sherry Turkle, professor at Harvard. And her book is called Reclaiming Conversation, The Power of Talk in a Digital Age. It's important to say that Sherry Turkle was first a very welcoming, she was welcoming the revolution by internet, as she would say that it could democratize our conversations. There would be less hierarchy in our conversations. It would actually make people connect to one another a lot more. But then actually the results came in, and well, all these fashion words like echo chamber, filter bubble, perhaps even fake news were popping up, and she said, this is not moving in the right direction. If we would like to have societies that function, and societies that, let's use the word horizontal, where people acknowledge one another, it is important to reclaim our conversations. And by reclaiming conversations, she means those conversations that you have with strangers, conversations that you might have with people that you don't know beforehand, people that you perhaps meet on the street. And it's the power of talk in a digital age. And I would argue that there is one place where you actually are almost obliged to say hello to one another, and this is when you're walking a city. If you're walking a city on foot and you're meeting somebody else on foot, the one thing you can say is hi, and that could be the beginning of a conversation. And that is something very important in a society that has perhaps lost the ability to meet strangers, or to meet the unexpected, or to actually deal with somebody that you don't know yet. And well, if you look back at all those things that I've been saying here, let's try to sum up a few things. Kleinenberg, he showed how neighbors talking to one another produce a healthy social fabric. And he also argues that talking to other people and dealing with the unexpected helps you to actually be positive about yourself, which might also be a good thing because it allows you to talk to even more people. So we might not stop our dystopian futures by greeting a stranger, but at least it could help prepare us to deal better with a new pandemic coming. Having a conversation with a stranger might even give you something to talk about once you go back to the bar. And if you're afraid of having no small talk, at least you can talk about what you have discussed with a stranger that you met by coincidence on the street. And I think that is important. So if we'd like to live in a resilient city, it might just start by saying hi, because most conversations start by hi, as did mine, and most end up with saying bye, and so does mine. Bye.